All right, the last colonial region that I want to talk about are the Southern Colonies. The Southern Colonies are sort of loosely defined as Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Also, sometimes Maryland, just kind of depends. Maryland tends to float between the mid-Atlantic colonies and the Southern colonies, depending upon how you choose to look at it. Southern colonies, by and large, are royal colonies. Virginia starts as a charter colony, but has become a royal colony by the mid 17th century. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia are all royal colonies from the outset. So they have royal governors, and as a result, they maintain a very distinguished British influence. Oftentimes, a lot of the large landowners who exist in the Southern colonies were large landowners in England as well, or oftentimes wealthy sons who didn't have land in England acquired land in the Southern colonies, which gives rise to a large plantation-based economy, as we'll talk about in a second, because the key to understanding the colonial South is to understand its dependence on cash crops. So a cash crop is a crop that you raise as a commodity. It is something that you have no intention of consuming yourself. It's something that you have every intention of selling on the market. And as a result, your livelihood is dependent on the market factors which are prevailing at the time. The key cash crops are, particularly in Virginia and North Carolina, tobacco. And then the further south you go, we have things like rice, indigo, pictured in the top right. And then especially, and we should never forget that there were also Caribbean colonies in existence at the same time, sugarcane. Sugarcane and sugar, which comes from it, and rum, which is a byproduct, are one of the most important economic drivers of the early Southern colonial economy, especially because if you look on a map, those Southern states are much better situated to engage in active trade with the Caribbean. We'll talk about some of the limitations that the British are going to place on that trade next time when I talk a little bit about Bacon's rebellion. So what we see develop in the South throughout the colonial period is something that I'm going to at least call a Southern caste system. So a caste system is a system that dictates your position in society, often by your birth, who your parents were, et cetera, et cetera. This can be tied to job. In some instances, there are religious components to it. But in the colonial South, it was really a question of two things: one, land; two, race. Because the Southern colonies are going to be much more invested in the chattel slave system that is going to predominate the Southern United States all the way up through the Civil War. But the Southern caste system is a little bit more interesting than that, because at the very top, you have a group of wealthy elite planters. And this includes such founding fathers as Thomas Jefferson, of course, a famous wealthy elite planter in Virginia. These are individuals who own the best land and hundreds upon hundreds of acres. They have many workers underneath them and will have many enslaved persons as well. But I'll get to that part in just a second. Now, the sort of in-between is the interesting group. In-between group is small landholders. Those are oftentimes people who are holding more marginal pieces of land, much, much further to the west, not on the coast, which is going to be one of the sticking points in Bacon's rebellion. And then those people who work in the few industrial cities that the Southern colonies possess, places like Charleston, South Carolina, and so forth, and so on. That's sort of the marginal group in between. But the marginal group is still not the bottom, because the bottom is occupied entirely at this period of time by indentured servants and enslaved persons, predominantly enslaved West Africans. Now, that group is going to grow increasingly over time, and the sort of racial component is going to only increase as time goes on. The important thing to remember is that no matter what, poor white people who are in the middle are able to kind of look down on the enslaved people on the bottom, and that gives them a sense and a reason to buy into the system. But it wasn't always that way. Enter stage left, indentured servitude. So indentured servitude is the number one way that England attracts workers to the colonies early on. When England lands in the Virginias and then even in Massachusetts and so on and so forth, there's a lot of land and there's a lot of opportunity, but there's no one to work the land. So right from the beginning, the Americas suffer from this critical, you'd call it a labor shortage. Now, the way that England chooses to solve this problem, especially early on, is predominantly through indentured servitude. There really isn't a concept of chattel slavery in the English colonies. There is in the Spanish colonies, but there isn't in the English colonies until at least the middle of the 17th century. Up until then, the labor pool is dominated by indentured servants. So, what is an indentured servant? So, an indentured servant is someone who essentially sells themselves into what's called indenture. So, it's a period of time that you agree that you are going to work for someone else. It's usually 3 to 7 years, depending upon the age. The younger you are, the longer the term is. This is supposed to be a temporary condition, but of course, the landowner's incentive is to increase your term. And so there's all kinds of colonial laws that allow individuals to increase their term, so on and so forth. Now, there are both European indentured servants and there are African indentured servants, although oftentimes African indentured servants see their term extended to life, which doesn't make it much different from slavery, although, as we'll talk about in a moment, there's a key difference there. Indentured servitude, especially in colonies like Virginia, is absolutely crucial to the success of the colony because tobacco plants require a lot of effort and people don't want to do it. So, how are you going to do it? You're going to do it through a period of indentured. Sadly, most people who become indentured servants never survive the end of their term to get what the dream that they've been sold, this idea that they're going to get free land, that they're going to get an opportunity to start over. And this is a vast majority of people who are in Virginia. Up until 1650, it's anywhere between 1/2 to 2/3 of the total population either is presently indentured or has recently been freed from a condition of indenture. And it wasn't always a voluntary thing that people entered into, by the way. This is kind of your quasi voluntary servitude. Oftentimes, people who were threatened with what's called transportation. So it could be part of your prison sentence. You could be convicted of a crime in Great Britain, and you'd have to choose the gallows or the New World as an indentured servant. Most chose at least the chance of the New World. Now, as with just about anything, and we'll talk about it more when we get into chattel slavery a little bit deeper here, but conditions were markedly different for men and women. Most indentured servants, the vast majority, were male. For females, indentured servitude meant a lot of additional risks. Well, I'm not going to say that sexual violence and sexual assault was a guarantee for women who signed up as indentured servants. It was all but a guarantee. All you have to do is look at the court records of the number of young women giving birth to masters' children and or getting quote unquote married to their masters shortly after arrival to realize that there was a lot at stake here for young women choosing to come to the New World. Chattel slavery, on the other hand, is unbelievably limited up until 1650. Up until that point, we're talking about less than 1% of the total Virginia population. There's not even any real laws until 1670, 1664, anywhere in that range, governing, the idea of chattel slavery. It exists in the Spanish colonies, but it doesn't even exist in the English colonies. So what happens is people are just called indentured servants for life until in 1664, a law is passed in Virginia declaring that the children of a West African woman would bear the same status as the mother. So what this does is this converts African and also Native American into a hereditary racial or ethnic status. And that's going to be crucial down the line as we talk about the difference. But what I want to stress is that there were opportunities for people who came to the New World. And most were coming as indentured servants at this point, but there were huge, huge risks that you had to take as well. And those risks very much dictated whether you stayed in Europe or whether you went to the New World.